Hey guys, before we start the show, I just want to give a quick shout out to another podcast. Go check out the Pacific War Podcast, week by week, hosted by yours truly, Craig Watson, in association with Kings and Generals, found on all podcast platforms like Spotify. Give it a click. You'll like it. Welcome back to the Pacific War channel, the channel where we cover the Asia-Pacific War of 1937 to 1945 and all the events that led up to it. Though we have yet to really touch anything within 1937 to 1945. I am here joined by three guests. I guess we'll start with a new face, Dana.
Yeah, hey guys. Well, I'm from Adventure Allies. You saw the other half of Adventure Allies in the last episode, and well, I'm Dana, and yes, I've been doing YouTube for say about a good 6 months or so now, and so look forward to having this kind of like political discussion and talk about history, and looking forward to it. So thanks for having me on.
It's good to have you on. And from the last episode, we have Canada Watch.
Hey, it's me, Nick from Canada Watch. Craig, thank you for having me back on. It's always a pleasure. Really nice to kind of discuss, political and historical issues. There's certainly some interesting stuff we'll get into about in this episode regarding Canada, which is really cool. So on Canada Watch, we cover Canadian news, politics, and business. We try to do it in a super unbiased and fair way. And currently, we're doing some really interesting stuff. So if you like Canadian news or politics stuff, check it out.
And the traditional guy that's in almost every single podcast at this point, Mr. Economics, Justin.
I told you can't call me that anymore now that Spooner's here. He's the real expert. But
I have to keep that meme going.
What's up, everybody? Good to see you again. Glad to have the boys back, and let's get into it.
And as usual, for anyone who might be coming from Kings and Generals who's not used to my podcast over on this other channel, my podcast basically follows every YouTube episode I make. So each YouTube episode has a following discussion, which we're doing now. And if you're an audio listener, which would be awesome because can't get enough of you guys, you probably are listening to the episode and then this follows immediately afterwards. And this episode was China during World War I, which took a long time to research. It's a pretty obscure subject. And I mean, the way we've always kind of started this off is I just kind of like to ask, the guests, what did you think of the episode? Because I'm sure all of you had almost no knowledge of this. It's pretty niche. And what did you learn off the bat? Start with Dana.
So, well, I took notes on the different parts with some questions because honestly, I won't lie, I had zero knowledge going into this episode. So I did find it pretty eye-opening in terms of, China being in a sort of weakened state in this period of history. And well, in terms of my notes, I mean, they're more in the form of questions to learn more. So I think
go right ahead.
So in terms of like the siege of Tsingtao, I was just like wondering, maybe you could elaborate on, kind of, I guess, the context of why China was such in a politically / militarily, economically weakened state. That would be of interest to me to know a little bit more of how that came to be in that period of time.
Yeah, so it's kind of ironic because my entire channel has basically been explaining why China was just broken down beginning in kind of the 1800s. What ended up happening, to brutally summarize, they went through two opium wars where Britain, France, and even the United States a little bit kind of were smuggling opium into the country and devastating them as a population. So their economy kind of went into ruin. The population became actually addicted to the substance, like it was ruining their society. And then on top of that, internally, they went through a civil war where the casualties were actually more than like World War One. It was one of the worst wars in human history. And it was followed by 50 other revolts and rebellions. And it all kind of crashed into this situation called the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, where China tried to pick itself up and fight back against the Western powers, which was like 8 different nations, got crushed again. More rebellions happened, and the dynasty that had been running for almost like a few hundred years at that point collapsed, and China tried to form its first republic immediately at the same time that World War One was like unleashed. And yeah, it was completely fractured politically. No one was really at the helm of all of China. It was almost in a period where we call it the warlord era, where like a lot of these warlords rose up and took pockets of China and they controlled it with their own little armies. So China was in no position to say or do anything against anybody. And I mean, in this episode, you see how much they're getting bullied by Japan. That's kind of the big eye opener. But yeah, to brutally put it in a nutshell, China was picked apart and carved up by a lot of other nations for about 100 years.
That's really interesting. A great point you brought up, Dana, regarding just the we live in a time right now where we are seeing a rising China and one competing for global supremacy. So to kind of reflect back on just maybe over 100 years ago, how there's such a crazy difference in the state of affairs, which is really eye-opening in many respects. I had a really interesting thought I kind of wanted to dive deeper on, and that is the kind of going between Japan and China, and that kind of with the siege of Tsingtao and how that all played out. There was an interesting tactic that was used, and I thought was worth discussing, which was the listing of demands prior to actions. This is something that is common in wartime tactics and the kind of pre-war phase of many conflicts. It's used particularly in World War II. More recently, but I was really surprised that Yuan Shikai got the 13 demands and he accepted the demands. Usually you kind of set those demands as the aggressor, if you want to call them that. Perhaps that's my misinterpretation of history or whatnot, so no one get offended, please. But it's like it's interesting to see that play out, and usually you set out a list of demands that is so unreasonable that your eventual opponent cannot meet them, and then if they do meet them, then it's considered a major victory anyway. But it's usually meant to just get a rejection, so you have a pretext for war. If you could maybe shed some light on, or what you might know about the subject of maybe why those demands were accepted, or the kind of dynamics of those demands between Japan and China and how all that played out.
Yeah, so originally the 13 demands was actually the 21 demands, which were ridiculous. It would have made China an actual protectorate of Japan. Like it was, no one could actually accept it.
It would have been a colony.
Yeah, even the Genro of Japan, which is kind of like the elder advisors, most of them thought it was ridiculous. Like there's too many pretty ridiculous demands in there. But the whole reason why Japan kind of slipped that in is because of World War One. The Western allies, who all kind of had their, we'll call it, spheres of interest in China, because everyone had their own businesses in different pockets of China, they couldn't do anything or actually come to China's aid. The only one who could have kind of done something was the United States, which was already the enemy of Japan at that point. So they didn't really care so much if they bugged the United States. And they placed these demands on Yuan Shikai, and it was kind of an unsaid thing that he should not have publicly shown them. It was supposed to be secret because it was embarrassing for both countries, these demands. It was supposed to be a secret message, and it got slipped, probably intentionally, to the public. They freaked out. Then China cut it down to the 13 demands, taking out kind of the worst demands that were there to alleviate Yuan Shikai's position so that he would actually sign it. And like you asked, why would he possibly sign such a horrible thing? he wasn't really firmly in charge of China. It was still fractured. He had only come into power through very bad ways, mind you. He's not beloved, we'll say that. And it was seen as the only way to thwart even worse conditions, because if he didn't sign them, it's like you said, it could have been a precursor, maybe not for full-scale war, but what Japan particularly liked to do to China was have unofficial wars, you would call it, where they would just come, occupy territories, and say that they're protecting the interests of Japanese civilians or something there.
One of the things I found interesting about the 13 demands was that the U.S. sort of took position once the demands became public, and I was sort of curious as to like, well, why would they have a stance on that in terms of like, why not let them do their own thing, and why they chose to like not officially recognize certain aspects of the demands.
Yeah, so America famously was the only country when all the countries began carving up China, literally like imperialistic. They would take spheres of influence, rename stuff, and completely take over the business, and even tax citizens there. France, Britain, Germany, all the countries. The United States was late to the party, and what they did was something called the open door policy, and basically it just meant that everybody could do business with China, but on equal terms, which was no better for China, mind you. I mean, I guess it was a little bit better than actually being carved up. But the United States was always adamant about having free trade and allowing everyone to be on kind of like an equal footing going into whatever investments they're going to do with the Chinese. Not equal for the Chinese, mind you. And what Japan's 21 demands did was pretty much step all over the open door policy. And it was, it's one of those big things actually that pissed off the United States so much, it kind of leads to the Pacific War later.
Wow. But what do you think the U.S. was kind of doing it as sort of a backdoored way to keep Japan from getting too much ground as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because they were already kind of going head to head, and it seems like the U.S. didn't want to start a direct conflict, but sort of wanted to, kind of get the reins on Japan and keep them from expanding too rapidly or going head to head with somebody else for no reason.
Yeah, it's sometimes hard to think about because when you consider the United States at that point in time, they're not the colossal like Goliath that they are today. And they did have to kind of play footsie when they did any of these diplomatic things. Like pissing off Japan was actually a huge threat to the United States because they had the Philippines, and the Philippines were just, in the back door of Japan. Japan could have invaded the Philippines at any moment, and the United States probably couldn't really do anything about it. So yeah, they had an awkward relationship right after the Boxer Rebellion about.
Yeah, but it still seems like they're trying to sort of, I'm not saying sway everything in a direction that would directly benefit them, but they seem to be kind of that little angel whispering in the ear of certain people at certain times. Like for example, when you get into the end of the episode, they're the ones that kind of nudge China to declare war on Germany. And being the fractured state that China was in, that was a risky move regardless. Might have been the right one, but
even myself, there probably a lot of arguments as to kind of why the United States gave that nudge, but one of the biggest reasons is to mess with Japan, because whoever gets involved in the war gets technically invited to the table at the peace conference at the end, which China did get invited to, but they got really screwed over during. And the United States probably just wanted to say, hey, look, we're doing this, we're going to be at the peace conference, it's in your best interest, like get involved, you'll probably get something at the end, and Germany isn't in a position to really attack you right now. I mean, it actually helped them get some debt off of they didn't have to pay Austro-Hungary anymore, they didn't have to pay Germany off anymore because of the declaration of war.
Yeah, well, that was a big one because when we talked about the Boxer Rebellion, we did our episode on them. I remember that those reparations, or whatever you'd want to call them, that they had to pay were actually pretty freaking hefty.
China paid reparations for the Boxer Rebellion until 1945. I think.
Jesus.
Yeah, it's and it's an unrealistic amount of money. It's
that's what we went over in the episode, and the fact that even if they managed to get away from some of it is kind of a victory from them just in that sense.
Oh yeah, I think it really paid off to declare war. Yeah. Oh, so any other questions? Is there, I didn't expect these kinds of questions. They're interesting. Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering if one of the things like that the talk of Japan is sort of like, having me reflect on is like the fact that like the US actually considered like Japan so heavily in their decisions, and as to parallel to today, whereas Japan is more like way obviously more pacifist, which for understandable reasons. And so we all know what led to Japan taking on a more pacifist way of being, but like maybe like I'd be interested to know about their culture, how their leadership was, and what their sort of military stance was at that point that actually intimidated the US to the point where like they were at they were on the main
They were the big dogs in the Pacific, basically.
yeah.
What kind of happened was there was a war between Russia and Japan in 1904 to 1905 called the Russo-Japanese War, and Japan like shocked the entire world. They not only defeated the Russians navy-wise and on the land, mind you, but Russia ended up sending a second fleet after it lost its first one to Japan, and then had that entire fleet destroyed. So it was like the first time in history that a non-white nation like just straight up punched one of the big powers. It shocked the entire world. Like everyone couldn't believe it. And both nations were financially bankrupt, still fighting the war. So they wanted to look for a way out. So what you usually do is you find like a neutral third party to do a negotiation for you. They chose Theodore Roosevelt of the United States, good friend of Japan at the time. They thought, oh, this guy was saying good things about Japan. He was one of the few people in the world who thought Japan might have a chance against Russia, so they chose him. When Roosevelt came to the table to help mediate the negotiations between the two countries, Roosevelt immediately was kind of like talking to his advisors, and they realized that Japan was a huge threat to the United States' interests, whether it be in China or just in the Pacific, because the United States had quasi colonies in the Pacific and stuff, and Japan had a huge navy that the United States probably couldn't do anything about at that point. Even in World War I don't think they could touch them. So Roosevelt basically, not that he screwed over Japan on purpose, but he made the negotiations go in a certain way where Japan didn't come out too great after the war. And the entire population of Japan basically demonized the United States ever since. And they pretty much thought Roosevelt was the devil and that he had stolen their victory from them because they didn't get any reparation payments for the war. So all of their boys that went off to the war to die, there was no money coming in to like cover the costs. There was a huge economic collapse because of it and all this stuff. But after that, the United States basically made its entire military program to thwart Japan in case Japan ever went to war with them. And they designed a lot of plans, like there's a plan called War Plan Orange. If Japan goes to war with the United States, how they're going to defend the Philippines and how they're going to defeat the island nation of Japan. And it would involve actually building the Navy as they would fight and all sorts of stuff like that. So you have to always remember the United States it wasn't the Goliath it was that it is today. And they were just starting to build the Pacific Fleet. And I guess you got to play with the chips you got. So for the most part, when the United States was considering who's the biggest threats to them, Japan might have been I'd say Japan was the number one threat to them for quite a while, since about 1904.
Wow, that's saying something.
Yeah, it's not like it's Germany. Like the United States, this is a hilarious story. The United States made plans and they color coded them. So War Plan Black was if Germany started a war, which would have been World War I, and tried to attack the Caribbean islands that France owned that were really, really close to the United States, what the United States would do to repel them. And then the United States had really, really hilarious plans. Like, what if they went to war with Britain in 1910? Well, they'd have to invade Canada. So they had War Plan like Crimson for Canada, War Plan I think it was ruby for India, emerald for Ireland, everybody that the British had. And they had war plans for like Cuba and every single nation you can even think of. And yeah, but war plan orange was the most important. It was if Japan went to war with them, because the United States had so much money invested in China, and they had so many colonies in the Pacific that would have easily fallen to the Japanese, and did in 1941.
Speaking of the Chinese economic element, I found this part of the episode super interesting. So I wanted to get your thoughts on it and kind of discuss it. The export. So from what I understand in the episode, there's a bit in the early part of the war, a detente, where it's like, okay, we're not going to do a combat role, but they certainly use their manpower to export their economic force, which is their workforce, to all parts of the world. And in order to kind of get a better sense of things. And that in war is a highly underrated aspect. The economic machine that, can build infrastructure and all sorts, they've been taking trenches and they're doing all sorts of cool stuff. And I thought what was really interesting is the point that was brought up about how in China itself, they saw this as a huge asset, not only to assist in the effort to a non-combat role, but also to gather new technical skills that they could then bring back to their homeland, not just economically in the form of money in terms of amounts received, but in terms of the kind of skills they would learn from in best practices, and then be able to bring it back to the homeland and they get a technological benefit later on. What are your thoughts on that strategy and your general sort of thought about how they did this in the war and its impact?
When I had to start this venture, because this is it's a World War I series. When I started, I said to myself, okay, I want to do Japan World War I, because Japan, might be shocking to hear, Japan was probably the greatest victor of World War I, because they put the least amount of effort in and got the best results after the United States, who kind of switched. The United States basically turned over the world economically and became the powerhouse, where the economy went from London to New York after World War I. Then I'm like, okay, I want to do China, obviously, because Pacific War China, I've been doing China and Japan. And I also did some other things like Tsingtao and the German Raiders. I didn't know myself really what China did in World War I, because when you ever talk about World War I, one of the first things you hear when it comes to Asia, so China was neutral. So you just think, okay, they did nothing. They just sat by idly. That's what I would have thought too. When I heard about the Chinese labor force, I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting. This is something to really look into in the episode. And then that ended up being, as you can see, like 80% of the episode, because it's incredible. Like, you never think about it. All the trenches, all like repairing the tanks, working in the factories in France and England, all that. It actually was a lot of foreign Chinese workers who came over, amongst other different groups. Like, there was also Vietnamese, Thai, and all sorts of other people. But the numbers of Chinese that went over is absolutely incredible. And then when you look at the Russian front in the east, it's even crazier, because the Chinese are just like flooding into Russia and there's no regulation at all. It became such a clusterfuck. But for China, you're like, okay, what do you get out of this except for the money? The technical skills. So if you have people working in factories, they're working in munition factories. They know how to make the shells that go in the ships or in any of the artillery pieces. They know how to repair tanks, the gears, the motors, and everything. So for the Chinese, the government was actually telling most of their brightest, please go over. They're getting students and flooding, particularly in France, like all these students, go over, learn everything you can, go into the universities, become translators, do whatever you got to do, and to bring it back to China to rebuild the country. And China was so humiliated after like almost 100 years of just being completely destroyed by everybody, that they wanted to build up, they wanted to modernize more. And World War I was like this kind of gleaming opportunity where they got a chance to really do that. Ironically, when World War I ended and they got shafted so much at the peace table, the country that came to their aid to really help them modernize after was Germany. They became best friends. Yeah.
That is interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. I couldn't help but ask this question, being the Canada Watch flag in the back here. The Canadian element in all this, which with the Chinese workers kind of stealthily coming through Canada in top secret, to get across so they can join the war front. If you could maybe open up some details about that, your thoughts, your comments about that element of society, particularly because at that time, obviously, the use and the presence of the Chinese workforce in Canada was, shall we say, quite controversial. So I thought it'd be nice to open up on that element to kind of look at the China-Canada element in World War One.
Yeah, because they had the above all else, they had the Chinese head tax. So if you think about it, every single Chinese who entered into Vancouver to get on that train would have had to pay technically that head tax amount, and it would have been astronomical, the amount of numbers. And then they went all the way through the country to Montreal. It honestly, this was like a crazy covert ops operation. They were shoved, I think I say in the episode, they were shoved in these cars and not allowed to get off for very good reason. Like you've kind of already alluded to, the United States on the California coast and places like British Columbia, there's a lot of laws that were put into place in like the 1880s to stop Chinese workers from bringing their families over at first. And then it turned into not allowing them to come into the country because they would come here to work on the railroads. But needless to say, the railroad workers who were Canadian or American didn't like that because they worked for cheaper. They were really enticed to work, mind you, better conditions for them over here than where they were, and they kind of took over. And yeah, so the labor unions, particularly in Vancouver, got really bad. A lot of Chinese were running out of town and stuff. So World War I's coming right after that, and there's still some exclusionary acts like in the 1920s, Japan will have something called the Gentleman's Agreement, where the government of Japan will just unofficially stop Japanese from kind of flooding into Canada and the United States. And for China, it was just openly racist. If you came, it depends on what year it is, but if you came over, you weren't allowed to bring your family. You had to pay a tax to be allowed to come in, and you were treated like dirt. So it was interesting to do that little story on how the British government tried to figure out a way to get all these Chinese to the Western Front, and you kind of think, oh, wouldn't they just go by ship all the way around the Cape of Africa and come up? But the German U-boats were such a threat that it was more feasible to actually go through the Pacific and then go over Canada. It was a lot safer.
Wow.
Yeah, and the Japanese were the ones protecting the convoys, ironically.
It's not often you hear Canadians strongly protecting their borders against illegal workers, you know?
Yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting stuff. What about just another just random thought? The presence of the Russia-Chinese element that you're talking about at the border. I was surprised to hear that there were Chinese Bolshevik army or unit at some point. Like that was crazy. I thought that was a really interesting take, and they were kind of like assigned the more, shall we say, controversial tasks of war. So, what was that like, and how did that all come to be?
It's a crazier story than I could even really touch upon. I even in the next episode, which is Japan during World War I fall into this kind of hole where there's a entire other venture that happens after World War I, technically at the end of it, called the Siberian Intervention. It's the Russian Civil War gets unleashed, and all the nations, like all the great powers, basically send these troops into Siberia to try and quell the Red Army. So they're trying to help the White Army to destroy them. And China, ironically, China sends a kind of very small group of like 2,000 something soldiers to fight the Red Army, like alongside everyone else. But because of the worker corps, China had hundreds of thousands of people that were in Russia who were not being regulated, and they basically were just left to do nothing. And they didn't know how to get home. They didn't know what to do. A lot of them don't speak Russian. They don't know where they are. So when they see like there's this group of these Bolsheviks, and they're like saying, oh, we're going to feed you and you're going to join the army, it's going to be great, we're going to do this whole thing, we're going to turn the world communist, blah, blah, blah. A lot of them are like, if I do this, maybe I'll get home at some point. So a lot of them join the Red Army and fight in just about every single front that the Red Army fights in. They're there. There's a really famous battle that happens when Romania attacks the emerging Soviet Union, and it's a Chinese division led by a really famous Chinese commander called Ren Fuxian, and he fights one of he's leading a Red Army battalion, and he ends up fighting against one of the generals in the White Russian Army alongside some Romanians and stuff. And it's this crazy battle. He ends up getting killed, and he's technically the first Chinese Bolshevik because he had joined the party before World War I think like in 1908 or something. It's a crazy story. I couldn't get into in the episode. But anyways, so yeah, the Red Army had a ton of these Chinese working for them. And ironically, the fact that they couldn't speak Russian was such a benefit because they could lead them anywhere to do anything. And because they didn't care about where they were, they didn't know anybody there, they don't speak Russian, they made for excellent executioners. So they would just use them to execute people. And they use them as shock troops in places, even during like places in Leningrad, there would be Chinese troops. And it was a huge propaganda piece against the Bolsheviks, even years after all this was kind of like done with. I remember hearing something once that Trotsky was angered because a bunch of people would say that the only reason why the Bolsheviks were able to win the Civil War was because of a bunch of foreigners that came in, like the Chinese and some others. And he was pretty angry to hear that because it took away from like the Russian cause, I guess you could say.
Do you think in part China was trying to snuggle up to Russia a little bit because they knew Japan still somewhat feared them in a way? You know, we've talked a lot about Russia being the big sleeping bear in that time period, and now with the World War kicking up, they're starting to wake up. So maybe China was trying to be buddy to sort of have the good old look at my friend here if Japan decided to get feisty.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Russia is the number one enemy of Japan. Even during the Pacific War, it's hard to think about when you consider that Japan was at war with like the United States is always the main person that, kind of puts the nail in the coffin. The entire time, the actual threat, the number one target has always been Russia for Japan, particularly communism. Japan is the most anti-communist country that's ever existed in the world. It's pretty crazy too, the lengths that they went. Yeah.
One of the things that I was wondering about, like when it comes to the Chinese Labor Corps in the West versus like the East, it seems like in the West, these Chinese people that are, like we said, they're basically put in cattle cars, heavily monitored, heavily controlled.
Yeah.
You go from point A to point B, and so strictly non-combat roles, and then they end up in the East. They end up in Russia. And how do they lose control so bad that they end up having these like red armies spring up, and you have like not only are they participating in combat roles, they're taking some of the more extreme combat roles of any war, and just to kind of contrast the what was so different in where they got. Like, was it the geographic location? Was it the countries that were monitoring the transporting of these people? What went wrong?
A lot of things. So to list the big ones, because this is actually very new information. No one really talks about this. There's a very famous YouTube channel, if any of you guys know, called the Great War Channel that covered World War I week to week for 7 years. And the narrator did one episode that touched upon this for I think 3 minutes, and he himself said that like some audience member told him about this and he didn't even know the information. I can say the same thing. I read a single article that kind of went into this. You can get all the information about every single Chinese unit on the Western Front, and it's all done beautifully. You can even hear about like the ones that stayed in France and built the Chinese communities there. But when it comes to the East, it's so bizarre. And it seems to be because the actual governments of Britain and France controlled all the Chinese that went over the Western Front. But when it came to Russia, Russia was so completely in chaos and such a mess that they just allowed some private companies to just send them over. And these private companies were probably a bunch of corrupt officials. Like, I think I named one company called the Yusheng Company or something. They seem to be like one of the big ones. And there's zero regulation. So they would send Chinese wherever in Russia without even proper attire, mind you. Like a lot of them show up to Siberia. They're like not dressed for it and they would die. And whoever would get the Chinese, maybe they didn't even speak the language. They didn't have supervisors. There was no policies or regulations. Whereas on the Western Front, like they were actually, like you said, kind of like pushed on these cattle cars, and they're put in line. I mean, it was terrible conditions. There was racism, but at least there was some semblance of control and organization. Whereas in Russia, they were sent to all these different countries in the East, and they were sent to do really bizarre jobs that really sucked. I couldn't go into it, but the Siberian Railway wasn't really completely constructed. So these Chinese were like sent to go do the railway in like inhumane places where you couldn't even cut down trees to survive. And a lot of them died. It's horrible. And then the thing that came up the most in the article I read was when they were done work, whoever was the supervisor would just leave. So a ton of these Chinese would have no idea where they were. They didn't know what to do, and they had no idea how to get home. So
the hell?
Yeah, it's hilarious. So basically, the Red Army really kind of clued in when they saw this. And they're like, "Oh my God, look at all these people that we can just grab to our cause." White Army really dropped the ball on that one because they would have had quite a force, maybe 100,000. I think there was an estimate that like 100,000 Chinese fought for the Red Army during the Civil War. That's pretty crazy.
If I mean, now we're getting into heavy speculation, but if that flipped over to the other side, do you think it goes differently?
That's a tough one. Maybe. It's hard to say because it wasn't a normal war. It's not like they were fighting guerrillas. The Red Army wasn't necessarily just a guerrilla army or anything like that, but the city centers were so strongly controlled by them. It seems like the Civil War was going to happen one way or the Red Army is going to win. Yeah, one way or another. The forces that all the other nations sent in, which was a ton, like Japan sent a shit ton of people into Siberia to just take over territory secretly, and they couldn't do it.
Like we said, big sleeping bear.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure how we're doing on time here, but I do want to ask one more thing.
Sure.
Let's talk about we kind of touched on it a bit before, but this is stuff that's really interesting, from the political element, which is the post-war conference. Obviously, yeah. China does not get their way in the slightest. And this leads to outrage nationally in their own country, led by the student demonstrations that really sparked a renewed sense of Chinese nationalism that ended up bleeding into the working class, which then took over when it went from Shanghai to Beijing. And it was, if I'm understanding that correctly. And then there was the influence of Marxism a bit in there as well that kind of really set the tone for later events. Maybe if you could talk a bit about the dynamics behind that and, how it maybe set the tone for future events in history.
It has a name. It's called the May 4th movement. It's one of the biggest events in Chinese history, and a lot of audience members after this episode asked me, can you please do a single episode on it? And I do plan to. The thing is, the May 4th movement happens directly after World War I in 1919 about. So I kind of keenly touched a little bit in the episode. I think I gave it like 30 seconds or something. I'm going to have a full episode on it because it's super complicated. Like you said, it starts off as students, and a lot of them had gone overseas over to France to become translators for the war. But they had gone to the universities. They learned so much ideology from the West, like about democracy, about all the great historical events, everything in the day, and how to really build the country. So when they came back to China, this ideology really sparked a lot. And they started this protest. Then the workers got involved because they were unhappy, and the Marxists got involved because a bunch of the people that were fighting the Red Army, these Chinese, eventually came home and they brought in the ideology of Marxism. So it became the perfect storm. It's if you were talking to like a CCP official, they'd say it's one of the great moments, for the movement to start the Communist Party, which will get founded in 1921, if I'm not mistaken.
21, you said? Yeah, I did take note, and you said the Civil War was 1927.
Oh yeah, for the Chinese Civil War.
Yeah, I took note of Marxism taking root in development of CCP in July 1st, 1921.
Because the period right after World War I is absolutely insane in China. You have it's called the warlord era, but during the warlord era, Chiang Kai-shek, which is the generalissimo, the national figure who will be in the Pacific War, he basically takes control of a large part of China, but he is the most adamantly anti-communist guy. He's the counter to Mao Zedong, and Mao Zedong, he'll rise up later in 1921, mind you, but the founding of the Communist Party, it's really low key, it's slow, but the workers eventually, they get a lot of numbers, they start to build an army, which is their own Red Army, which is built off the Bolsheviks from Russia. They're using the same model. They fight Chiang Kai-shek's forces. They get beaten really, really, really bad. They run for their lives. They hide in a pocket, and then they start educating themselves. And eventually, during World War II, China isn't just facing the Japanese, they're facing the communists within their own country, and then eventually the communists will win. But it all has roots right now in World War One, with the May 4 movement particularly. It's a very complicated history.
Yeah. And this is all for a country that wanted to remain neutral or didn't even want to take part in this war because of how fractured they were.
Oh, they wanted to take, they kind of wanted to take part. It's just they couldn't. Yuan Shikai immediately, I think I say it a little bit in the episode, he tried to offer 50,000 troops to take Tsingtao to get rid of the Germans. But it's Japan secretly saying that they're not allowed to do that because Japan does not want China to be big. Japan's whole being at this point is to be the power in Asia, and they want China to be a protectorate. That's basically that's been their destiny since the Meiji Restoration. And they have a strong stronghold on Britain because Britain's the ally to Japan, and Japan's like, hey, you want us to come over and help you in this world war? Because they do. Well, tell China to back off. That's what's kind of happening.
Yeah.
And I definitely have to get to this point in the episode because the audience is really keen on me just saying their comments and their questions. So I have a few that I found for this episode, although this episode did not nearly do as well as the other World War One episodes. It's a bit slower. I'm a little bit sad about that. I don't know. I hope it picks up at some point. But the first question I have, which is the same question I get in every episode I do, is what movies did you use for the clips in this episode? There's one main one that I used the hell out of that has nothing to do with World War One, which is ironic. It's 1911 with Jackie Chan. So it's actually it's the Qingdao Revolution where China forms its first republic. But there's Yuan Shikai fighting the resistance in China, and Jackie Chan's part of the resistance. And I wanted some kind of feeling of a war going on because China technically doesn't get to fight other than in Siberia a little bit. So I just wanted a little bit of invigoration. So I used clips from that. Other than that, I used actual footage of the Siberian Intervention, which was raw, which shows a lot of funny stuff, like people who don't know they're being filmed doing silly things. There's this one clip, I didn't put it in the next episode. There's 10 Japanese generals trying to figure out how to smoke cigars, and they aren't cutting them right. And it's 10 minutes of them trying to figure out how to smoke cigars. It's really funny.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And footage for this for the Chinese Labor Corps was from a British documentary made a long time ago. I got another question. When will you make a Chinese warlord era video? That era is hella confusing. It's coming right after this one. To the audience member who I know who it is, he talked to me after because he's researching it himself. It's coming. Maybe it won't be the immediate episode after this one, but it's definitely going to be at minimum a 3-part series really soon. Next question or comment. Let me look at my notes. Great stuff. Many don't believe World War I was truly a global war, but it absolutely was. Love the World War I content. Keep it coming. And if you ever like to collaborate on a World War I video in the future, let me know. Yeah, sure. I love collaboration. I early on in my YouTube career, I collaborated with this one guy who really grew, and we made this video. It was a movie review of The Last of the Mohican. I don't know if you guys saw that one. And we got a lot of views for that video. It did really well. I did the Quebecois perspective on it because there's, it's the founding of Quebec in there too. And a lot of people liked it. So I'm going to read more questions. There's a few more. Happy Thanksgiving. great video. I'm thankful for the channel. Oh, sorry. Okay, so this guy, just wanted to make a note. This guy, my statistics said he was the top commentator in my whole channel, and he received the most hearts from me. He knows who he is. Very good guy. Another one was a random comment that just states, Japan definitely has a warrior spirit. Yeah, sure. And the last one is, I want to pet your bird. Yeah. I hope it's my actual parrot.
No, you don't. No, sir, you do not. That is a very, very mean bird. Okay, run quickly.
Little known fact, you don't get to see some of the comments that come up because they just get flagged by YouTube. But I get a lot of sexual advances on this channel.
Nice.
Like a lot. It's been interesting to read through those.
What? Yeah, I don't even know what to say to that. You know, that's the purpose of a history channel. Craig's.
Hey, you've been in a few videos beside me, Justin. I don't know. There's been a few comments about you too.
Oh, and you haven't been kind enough to share them? Oh dear.
YouTube's the new Tinder. What is this? I had no idea.
Yeah, this is actually a secret dating show for all of you who know. Canada Watch is currently on the market. All right.
I don't know what this is, but
half of Adventure Allies as well.
Anybody who wants for $100, I can leak a cell phone number. No problem.
Great time to say. You only talked a little bit at the beginning about your YouTube channels, but I want to give you this opportunity to like tell the audience a little bit more. We'll start with Canada Watch. You know, like what have you been covering in the last week or two? Just to say to the audience to give them an idea.
Sure. Well, we are covering a few things. One is out in British Columbia. It is a really difficult state of affairs right now. They are facing major flooding, major catastrophe in the billions of dollars. We're talking about food shortages. We're talking about people panicking, supply chain issues, and they have a series of floods that may have long-term ramifications for that area. So we're covering that. We're also covering the inflation situation, very precarious for many Canadians. One of the things we really talked about in the last episode was shrinkflation, which is something that people are maybe not so familiar with, which is the idea of that you keep the same price for a product in order to honor supplier contracts, but you offer less of that product in the same thing. For example, a Snickers bar, instead of being 49 grams, might be 42 grams. And if you actually carefully look at many items in grocery stores and in general supply chain, you might notice that you might get the same price, but maybe not the same quantity. So that is something that is developing in the supply chain. And the last one we did is an introduction to a topic we're doing, which is we're going to be covering the evolution of financial markets in Canada, which includes the evolution of cryptocurrency in Canada, which has regulation here, which many people are not aware of. And I'm quickly informing myself on. And just so you have an idea of kind of fact that we dropped in the last episode, the global cryptocurrency market right now is $2.7 trillion USD, and the Toronto Stock Exchange, all equities listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange, is worth just a bit over $3 trillion. So it is growing quickly and becoming a bigger player in finance. So we're covering that and trying to give it a best link. Parliament's back. It's really charged right now, a lot of partisanship, so we're trying to stay out of that, but we're going to try to cover that as best we can.
And Adventure Allies.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, obviously, Nick, you know, I'm a huge fan of Canada Watch. I very much look forward to hearing all about the inflation situation, how crypto factors into that, as well as, you know, the latest coming from the House of Commons. Super passionate about that. On Adventure Allies, Jason and I have been playing a few games that we're having. Well, first of all, we're having a great time with Red Dead Redemption 2. We've been playing that for probably about a month now or so, but it's such a long story. There's always, you know, random encounters to experience, so we're turning some of those into shorts as well. We had recent success. One of our shorts got up to 17,000 views, so that was super exciting. We're playing Disco Elysium, which is sort of like a role-playing game where you play like an amnesiac a cop who wakes up from a night of drinking, doesn't remember he's a cop, and you just have to start doing a murder investigation. So we're having a lot of fun with that. And we're doing certain, kind of horror games, survival games. So like Amnesia, Resident Evil. So we're adding playthroughs really very quickly, actually. Our channel's filling up with games we've played. And so there's something for everyone. And we just got to 75 subs. So we're enjoying a good growth. I'm happy with that. And come hang out and just chill and hang out with the boys, and that's Adventure Allies.
So K and G guys and my regular old folks from the Pacific War channel, if you can go over to their YouTube channels and please hit that subscribe button and like and watch some of their videos, it would be greatly appreciated. Oh, and don't forget that his buddy Tupa Loops has a game review channel, and it is underappreciated. The guy's a meme lord. Please go watch some of them. You will not be disappointed.
Very,
Absolutely.
very good.
If I can just plug it, I'm his number one Tupa Loops fan, and I'm trying to get we're all trying to get him back on the Tupa Loops train. So if he does watch this, you got to get to the next review. We were supporting you, and yeah, it's just expertly done, like meme curation, great content, great reviews, and they're just such good products at the end of the day. And I just rave on and on about each review, watch them multiple times, and so Tupa Loops, we are waiting for the next Tupa Loops review.
I love the Overwatch one the best. Oh my god, I love that one.
Gold. Absolute gold.
Is it on par with KSI's? I haven't seen that one yet.
Oh, he did it justice.
Review?
He did it justice. He hit every single character, and it's so good. It's great. Honestly, audience members, go check Overwatch by Tupa Loops, please.
As a matter of fact, all those three channels, I've dipped into all three of them. Canada Watch is great. If you're into the more serious topics and want some really informed stuff, again, without trying to sling any bias on it, very, very cut down the middle, and it's a lot of fun to dip into there and get into some more serious topics too. So check these guys out, all of them.
Yeah, statistically, my channel's like mostly American. After that's Filipino and stuff, but I think I have like a 5% Canadian fan base. Come on, show some love to your fellow Canadians. Go check out Canada Watch.
Absolutely.
Oh,
That's great.
right.
Appreciate that. And before we wrap up, for your American fan base, you'll know that coming soon to Canada Watch will be a series we're going to work on, which is the growing dichotomy and relationship between Canada, the United States, and the political elements involved, and whether certain narratives that hold true in both countries are actually the case or maybe not. Stay tuned, find out.
All right, folks. So
You heard it here.
Yeah. This has been the Pacific War Channel podcast, which I have to make sure I put the channel in that whole title now, since I have another podcast which is called the Pacific War. It's confusing everybody. Over and out.